Sato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you again after a while. Happy New Year. And in our tradition, we also say Shubha Kalpataru, which means because on January 1st, Sri Ramakrishna blessed a number of devotees on January 1st, 1886, right? Yeah. In Kashipur. And this year, I was very fortunate to have been in Kashipur on that day. Whenever I'm in Bilumar, I try to go there by boat with the brahmacharis. And so I did that 5:30 in the morning. I went with a bunch of novices, monastic novitiates in Belumar. We took the boat across the Ganga to Kashipur, and because we're monks, there's a special area set aside for monks to sit and meditate in Sri Ramakrishna's room on January 1st. And it's a real sight to see because there's a block going for literally kilometers. People waiting all night for a 2-second darshan of Sri Ramakrishna in his room. Darshan means just a sight for a couple seconds. And then these ushers herd you out of the room, because you can't even stand for a second because there's so many thousands of people. So I was thinking that in the US, people only wait that long in lines for like Taylor Swift tickets or like, what's that thing called? Black Friday for like a cheaper laptop at Best Buy or something like that. But in India, it's for spiritual things. So that's a great thing, actually. I'm talking today on an interesting topic, Bhagavad Gita and positive psychology. Many of you probably know something about positive psychology, but if you don't, I'm just giving a very simple explanation of it. When Freud came along, he developed psychoanalysis, and the basic paradigm of psychology was if somebody is mentally ill or sick, has a neurosis, has a pathology, the aim of the psychologist is to make that person normal, whatever normal might mean. But the idea is to overcome his or her neuroses, pathologies. Positive psychology is kind of like the next step. It says that's great, but once we're normal, quote unquote normal, what do we do? How do we live a fulfilling life? How do we achieve genuine happiness, authentic happiness in life? So that's the kind of psychology 2.0 that positive psychology is so invested in. And Martin Seligman is considered to be one of the pioneers of this field of positive psychology. He's still living, but he's fairly senior now. He wrote a book in 2002 called Authentic Happiness. And I'll be structuring my talk today in terms of the framework that he develops in this book called Authentic Happiness. There are many other positive psychologists. He's done subsequent work after this book published in 2002, which I'll mention toward the end of the talk. So I'm not claiming to give a kind of comprehensive landscape of what positive psychology is. That would be a whole semester-long course. And I'm also not an expert in positive psychology. I'm a philosopher, not a psychologist. But what I'd like to do then is delimit the scope of what I'll be talking about. I want to focus on Seligman's theory in this particular book, Authentic Happiness, and make what I think are fruitful connections with the Bhagavad Gita, this great scripture of Vedanta. And I want to argue that this dialogue between the Bhagavad Gita, the teachings of the Gita, and positive psychology flow in both directions. And that positive psychologists, through their very recent scientific studies, help corroborate and kind of further develop certain ideas that are contained already in the Bhagavad Gita from many, many centuries ago. But at the same time, I think that if we think deeply and reflect deeply on the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, we can find certain limitations, weaknesses, blind spots in contemporary positive psychology. where I think Vedanta has something to contribute. So I want to kind of make the argument in both directions in the brief time that I have. So in his book, Authentic Happiness, Seligman distinguishes three paradigms for living well. And he distinguishes the pleasant life from the good life, from the meaningful life. These are the three different kinds of paradigms that he suggests. So I'm going to go through them one by one. This is a kind of useful structure for the talk, I think. So what I'll do is talk about how Seligman understands the pleasant life, and then make connections with the Bhagavad Gita, and then go on to the next, what is the good life? How do we move from just a merely pleasant life to a good life, and then from a good life to a meaningful life, and what insights can we glean from the Bhagavad Gita? So what is the pleasant life? It's kind of obvious, but it's a life of kind of hedonism, where you're trying to maximize sense pleasures and instant gratification. It's a life full of instant gratifications. There's a famous study done in 1972, which many of you are probably familiar with, but I'll just say it very quickly. The marshmallow experiment done at Stanford University. Walter Mischel did a study of 4-year-olds where he put a delicious looking marshmallow in front of these 4-year-olds and said, you can either eat this marshmallow now, or I'll leave the room and I'll come back in 15 minutes. If you can restrain yourself for 15 minutes, by the time I get back, then I'll give you 2 marshmallows. You'll get double the prize. And they had a video camera running as once the doctor left the room to see how the kids would react. And it was very funny. And 2 out of the 3 children in this experiment, I mean, there were many more than 3, but this 2/3 of the children, they succumbed within that 15 minutes and they ate the marshmallow. So they didn't get the second one. They succumbed to instant gratification. And the 1 out of 3 children who succeeded in holding out for those 15 minutes, this is what's interesting. This study, Mischel conducted, this was a longitudinal study, which means that he checked back on these children many years later, 15 or 20 years later, to see their life outcomes. And what he found is those 1 out of 3 children who were able to hold out back when they were 4 years old, to hold out for that second marshmallow, had far better life outcomes measured along various axes. So that means general well-being, SAT scores, educational attainment, what their jobs were, and many other things on many other axes. Body mass index is another thing. So what does this study prove? Well, one study doesn't prove anything, but it has since been replicated by several other people. There's still some controversy about the extent to which it's replicable. But Joachim de Posada, he reproduced the experiment for Latino kids at Columbia University. He found the same kind of result. But it's complicated when you get into the details. But I think that for our purposes, what's useful is, what's the basic lesson? The lesson is a life based on instant gratifications will end up being not a very happy life. And that the key to long-lasting fulfillment and happiness is actually delayed gratification. That's the opposite of instant gratification. These are the joys in life that come through struggle, challenge, effort, achievement, right? Things that aren't just handed to us on a platter, but something that we have to actually work toward. Like raising children is a good example. Making a marriage work, doing your job well. These are all things these are not instant gratifications. These are delayed gratifications. But the joy you get from it in the end is far more fulfilling than those instant gratifications that we all know about. You might say that this study was in the 70s, and why is it relevant now? Well, it's more relevant now than ever because we're living in an age, I think a really unprecedented age of instant gratification. Unprecedented, because the internet has changed everything. And I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to have been born in the 80s. And so I lived pre-internet and then also experienced post-internet. We're in the post-internet age now. But it's just remarkable how much life has changed since the internet has come around. And basically everything is oriented toward instant gratification. This is what I've seen. You know, when I was a kid and I liked certain TV shows, I'd have to wait a week before the new episode would come up. Now I can binge watch on Netflix. I can watch all 12 episodes in one day. And does anyone feel good after that? I mean, they might say so, but usually not, you know? And that's true of everything. In the past, to find a partner, you go to a singles night in a bar or something like that, or on a cruise. Now there's Tinder, and there's a million dating websites, and there's this and there's that. And then there are algorithms, very, very brilliant programmers who are developing very sophisticated algorithms to figure out what you like on the basis of your search, what you search for in Google and other things. The moment you click on one video on YouTube or something on Twitter or whatever, Instagram, the algorithm kicks in, and it'll give you 10 more of the same kinds of things. So it becomes a kind of echo chamber of instant gratification. You get as much of what you like anytime you want, 24 hours a day, pornography, anything you want. This is an unprecedented age of instant gratification. And yet there's an irony in this. You might think logically that, well, the more instant gratification we have, the easier it is for us to get what we want, the happier we should be. And yet exactly the opposite is the case. So we might even call this the paradox of instant gratification. There are a lot of studies done on this. There's a study published just last year, 2023, called The State of Mental Health in America. And what they found is that over 1/5 of Americans, over 50 million Americans, suffer from mental illness of some sort. A huge number suffer from depression. 11%, millions of adults in the US experience serious thoughts of suicide as well, with the highest rates among multiracial individuals. And so it's a full-blown mental health crisis. And so the question is why? So I first want to explore the answers that psychology and neuroscience give, contemporary psychology and neuroscience. And then I want to go back to the Bhagavad Gita and what further insights we can learn from that great Vedantic scripture. Anna Lemke is a Stanford psychotherapist. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. It was published 2 or 3 years ago. And many of you know this, but dopamine is a kind of a very, very summarily and roughly, like a craving chemical or a feel-good chemical. It's the neurotransmitter that allows you to feel pleasure, satisfaction. And this is a quotation from a book. She says, scientists rely on dopamine as a kind of universal currency for measuring the addictive potential of any experience. The more dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, the more addictive the experience. Okay, so dopamine is extremely important in the chemistry and psychology of addiction. So this gives us a first answer to the question of why, when we're confronted with this unprecedented time of instant gratification, we're unhappier than ever. The reason is, from the standpoint of neuroscience, would be that the more we indulge in instant gratification, the more our dopamine levels spike. Every time we get that, we push that, somebody hits that like button on one of our videos, or you name it, we watch a video that we like, or this or that, a million other things. What happens? We get this momentary spike in dopamine level. But what happens? Because of that, it's just a momentary spike. It goes down again. What happens after it goes down again? We desperately crave that dopamine spike again. So then we repeat the experience. The problem is, the more we repeat the experience, the more tolerant we become to the dopamine itself. And so the dopamine levels will drop. And so we need more of that activity or substance to get the same dopamine high that we got in the beginning, in the initial phase of our enjoyment. And it becomes this vicious cycle where we have to do more and more of that thing to make us feel good. And that makes us more and more miserable because the dopamine levels eventually crash down to the floor. So this is a kind of neuroscientific explanation of what's going on. In psychological terms, psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill. Even though we think that the more happiness, the more we fulfill our desires, the happier we'll be. In fact, that's not the case, because the body will always re-equilibrate itself and bring down the baseline level of dopamine or happiness, or whatever you want to call it. So they find that lottery winners are often unhappier than people who just have normal salaries, for instance. Now, But in the past, the big studies on addiction were done on drug addictions, substance abuse, people addicted to alcohol, cigarettes, various kinds of drugs. Now, almost everybody's an addict. That's the problem now. Social media, the internet has made all of us addicts, but of a different sort. We're not necessarily substance addicts, but we're behavioral addicts. So behavioral addiction is a massive problem now. It could be called a pandemic in its own right. The way that Anna Lemke puts it is the smartphone is the modern day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for a wired generation, because the phone's always with us. It's right here. And that means that we can always get that instant gratification that we're looking for. We don't have to go anywhere, right? And this is unprecedented. And she says, the pull of dopamine is so strong that studies have shown tweeting is harder for people to resist than cigarettes and alcohol. Really is a drug. She says, studies have shown that the constant stream of retweets, likes, and shares from these various internet sites causes the brain's reward area to trigger the same kind of chemical reaction seen with drugs like cocaine. In fact, neuroscientists have compared social media interaction to a syringe of dopamine being injected straight into the system. So this is a large part of the issue. There are also some other interesting experiments done on mice. A Swiss scientist named Christian Lucha, he did an experiment where there's a mouse in a cage, and he sets up a lever, and if the mouse pushes a lever, he gets he's able to activate his dopamine sensors, and so the dopamine level goes up. So the first time the mouse goes up the lever and hits it, it gets really happy because it gets that dopamine spike, and it just keeps hitting the lever, and it won't stop. And the scientist Lucia says that if we didn't stop the mice from hitting that lever 2 hours later, or several hours later, it would die of starvation. It'll do nothing else. There's I don't know, have any of you read David Foster Wallace's massive novel called Infinite Jest? But there's a similar premise about something like a video that somebody watches, which is so entertaining that they watch it until they'd starve to death and die. It's so pleasurable. But that's our age. I mean, he kind of anticipated our current age. And then he did this interesting twist on the same experiment where he put an electrically charged grid between the mouse on one side of the cage and that lever on the other. And the mouse is a little confused at first, then it kind of sets foot on the grid and then finds out to its unpleasant surprise that it's charged, and so it's very, very painful for the mouse to step on that grid. But it really wants that dopamine hit. So what does it do? With great difficulty and great pain to itself, it actually walks across the grid. And even if once it gets to the lever, it's still on the grid. And so every time it pushes the lever, it's still feeling pain from the grid, and still it won't stop. This reminds me of what Sri Ramakrishna says about worldly people. Worldly people are people, they're like camels. And there's a cactus tree. And that camel, stupid camel, to get that tiny bit of water in that cactus tree will cut through the needles and cut its mouth and bleed all over its mouth just to get that tiny bit of water. That water is that tiny bit of worldly fulfillment, but in the process, you get 10 times the amount of pain. So it's the same kind of thing. These rats, these mice, are undergoing the same kind of terrible suffering for that little bit of that little dopamine spike. And we might be thinking, poor mice, poor rats, but poor us, because we're those mice. And that lever, those dopamine levers have multiplied. Those dopamine levers are Netflix, the internet, social media, a million pornography, a million other things, drugs. Many of us are like those mice. So what can Vedanta tell us to help us get out of this very difficult, and as I said, I keep saying it, but I think it's important to keep this in mind, that it's really an unprecedented situation. The level of temptation is so high now. I think Bhagavad Gita has a lot of light to shed on this, on what Seligman calls the pleasant life and why it's so problematic. And I want to focus on chapter 18, verses 37 to 39. where Gita distinguishes three kinds of happiness. And I know that, I think last time I came here, I gave a talk on the three gunas, and I talked about this. So I hope I'm not too repetitive. I give talks in so many places that I forget whether I'm repeating myself. So my apologies in advance. But what Gita does is it classifies three kinds of sukham, happiness, in terms of the three gunas, which I would translate as energies. We talked about this last time. I'll just focus on the two main kinds of happiness that are relevant today: Rajasika happiness and Sattvika happiness. Rajas is the guna, the energy that makes us restless, full of desires and ambitions, and I want to do this, I want to do that. And it also is a source of egoism. It makes us kind of selfish and egoistic, arrogant. People who are very arrogant are very Rajasic. And very Sattvic people tend to be very humble, calm, more indrawn, have a kind of natural spiritual tendency, very compassionate toward others. So that's just a general overview of the gunas. But now, 18.38, this is Krishna's explanation of Rajasika happiness. He says, Pariname vishamiva, I'm Vishayendriya sanyogad yattadagrey mritopamam. Pariname vishamiva tatsukham radasamsrutam. Any pleasure based on the contact of any of the sense organs, eyes, ears, etc., with sense objects is a Rajasika form of happiness. And what's the structure of all forms of Rajasika happiness? They're like nectar in the beginning and like poison in the end. Like nectar in the beginning and like poison in the end. This is the structure of all instant gratification. And the Gita explains it so nicely. And the deeper Vedantic reason as to why it has this structure is because it's gratifying the body-mind complex. And we can never find ultimate fulfillment in the body-mind complex. We can only find ultimate true joy in the deeper soul. That's where Sattvika happiness comes in. We'll get to that later, but let's dwell for a moment on Rajasika happiness. Let's ask a little bit more deeply. Why is it that all forms of instant gratification are like nectar in the beginning, but ultimately become like poison? Sri Aurobindo, in his commentary on this verse in the Gita, he says, this joy, meaning Rajasika joy, is nectar to the lips at the first touch. But there is a secret poison in the bottom of the cup. And after it, the bitterness of disappointment, satiety, fatigue, revolt, disgust, sin, suffering, loss, transience. These are all, that whole laundry list of things are all different reasons why what begins as nectar becomes poison. It's not always one thing, but it's a combination of things. And it could be a different thing in each case, depending on the nature of the gratification we're talking about. Maybe you were expecting something a little more or better than what you actually got. That's disappointment. Satiety. If you do too much of something, you kind of get disgusted with yourself. Enough is enough. And then we can go on analyzing each of these. Transience, the very fact that it doesn't last, that itself is a source of suffering. If it could last forever, that's one thing. That would be nice, but it doesn't. It never does. In the Bhagavata Purana, there's an interesting story about King Yayati, who was full of rajas, very rajasic king, and he can't get enough of instant gratification, sense pleasures. He has many, many wives, still not satisfied. And so he lines up his three sons. I think there were three sons. And he says, it's obviously a fictional story. He says, which one of you will exchange bodies with me so I can enjoy for many more years to my heart's content? Because I'm an old man now and I want to enjoy more. And his youngest son was the most faithful. And so he said, oh, Father, I'm happy to exchange my body with you. And so they do. His father's very happy. And with his son's body, he continues to engage with many more women and this and that and all sorts of things. Bhoga, it's called bhoga in Sanskrit. Enjoyment, worldly enjoyments. And again, fictional story. So it goes on for thousands of years, apparently, this kind of enjoyment. And at the end of this very long period of intense hedonism, King Yayati hits what Aurobindo calls satiety. He says, all right, enough is enough. It reminds me again of one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. He would say in Bengali, Bhoganto na hole tag ashena. which means until you have passed through the end of enjoyments, you will not feel that genuine spirit of detachment and renunciation. Without experiencing things at least once, not everything, but some things, you won't be able to get over it. Fortunately for us, Hindus, Vedantins believe in karma and rebirth. So we don't have to necessarily go through all these experiences in this life. Many of us have gone through these experiences in previous lives, which allow us to move forward in this life. Some senior monks joked to us when we were in training center, they would say that it's because we married in a previous life that we don't have to in this life. So Yayati, King Yayati, after all those thousands of years of enjoyment, he comes to this insight. He says, Na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati habisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivadate. He says, desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. This is one of those lessons in life that it takes us many years to learn, if we ever learn it at all. We eventually do, but for most of us it takes too long. And he says instead, it's like this. Imagine there's a fire and you throw oil into the fire. What happens? The fire grows even greater, right? That's the problem. The more you satisfy desire, the hungrier that desire becomes. The Gita describes it as follows. Mahashano mahapapma vidhyanam ihavaidano. Know this to be your enemy in this life, Krishna says. Kama and krodha. Kama means worldly desires, lust especially. Mahashano mahapapma. It's all devouring, insatiable. It's never satisfied. No matter how much you feed it, it's like a pet that just is like a guinea pig or something. And the more you feed it, the fatter it gets till it bursts out of its cage. And it's never satisfied. And it'll start to terrorize you after some point. Mahapapma, this is the source of all sinful behavior. It makes us do incredibly stupid and foolish things that we wouldn't otherwise do. That's why drug addicts end up becoming, some of them become criminals because they have to steal money in order to get more of the drugs that they need and so on and so forth. Schopenhauer, who is influenced by Vedanta, he says a very similar thing. He says in his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, he says, every satisfied desire gives birth to a new desire. No possible satisfaction in the world could suffice to still our craving, set a final goal to our demands, and fill the bottomless pit of our hearts. He's a beautiful writer. He's a great stylist. So what's the way out? First thing is to strive as spiritual aspirants to be content with what we already have. Instead of coveting what our peer has. Oh, that person has a Rolex, and so now I need a Rolex. Or so be content with what you have. Vairagya Shatakam, there's a text called 100 Verses on Detachment in Vedanta. And there's a beautiful verse which says, Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala manasi cha paritushte kortafan ko daridraha. That person is poor, gives totally new definitions of wealth and poverty. That person is poor whose desires are great. Yasya trishna vishala. It's very interesting. Just think about it. It's a very deep point. That person is poor, truly poor, whose desires are great. Because even if you're an Elon Musk with billions of dollars and you're still full of desires, you're not happy. And if you make $50,000 or $40,000 and you're content with what you have, you're much happier than that billionaire. Manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. When the mind is contented, who is rich and who is poor? That's what this verse says. So, what does Vedanta tell us? It says, try to be content with what you already have. Once you're able to meet the basic necessities of life. And secondly, Krishna adds the following, and I think this is really useful for bringing Seligman in positive psychology into dialogue with Vedanta. He says, and also try to replace rajasika forms of happiness in your life, all the different ways that we're instantly gratified, with sattvika forms of joy, which involve delayed gratification usually, or at least in the beginning. Okay, and we'll talk about what Gita means by sattvika joy in a bit. So now, Seligman, as I said, he distinguishes three kinds of life. The first was the pleasant life. We just talked about it at length. And the problems with it. Big problem is the more we rush headlong into hedonism and instant gratification, the unhappier we become. So that's not a fulfilling life. He says there's another kind of life that we can lead, the good life. He takes this term from Aristotle, but he kind of makes it his own. And he says the following: how do we live a good life? He says we have to do two things. Number one, we have to identify our signature strengths. And if you have trouble, I think many of us kind of have some intuitive sense of what our strengths are. But if you have trouble with it, you can ask your partner or spouse. Your children can be brutally honest with you. Some of us like to think that we're strong in something, but then our loved ones bring us back to earth. And then there are also surveys. There's an online survey, I think, developed by him and his team. And I can post a link on the website if you're under the YouTube description. I did it myself, and it's very useful actually. And it gives you just a list of your top 5 signature strengths based on this questionnaire. So, first step, identify your signature strengths. Second step, find a calling, find a vocation that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths on a daily basis, regularly. Seems deceptively simple, but it's really deep. And it's true. And he says, Seligman says, the pleasant life might be had by drinking champagne and driving a Porsche, but not the good life. Rather, the good life is using your signature strengths every day to produce authentic happiness and abundant gratification. This is something you can learn to do in each of the main realms of your life: work, love, and raising children. He also links it to another major positive psychologist whose name I'm probably going to butcher, Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, I think, is one way of pronouncing it. He wrote a book called Flow, and it's a very, very important concept in positive psychology, and it's been adopted in like MBA programs and business fields and stuff like that. What he means by flow, what Csikszentmihalyi means by flow, is the following. He says, when you are engaged in an activity that is sufficiently challenging, so it shouldn't be too easy. If it's too easy, you'll be bored. If it's too hard and beyond your abilities, you'll get frustrated. So it's an activity that is challenging, but you're also up to the challenge based on your unique strengths and abilities. And if you can hit that sweet spot and you engage in that activity in a sustained way, you can enter a state of flow where you almost lose self-consciousness about it. I mean, I think many of you can imagine this. You probably have had these experiences in certain activities that you've done, where you're just completely one with the activity in a certain sense, and you lose self-consciousness. But it's a kind of joy that you can't even explain. So this is what Seligman is talking about. He says that when you are able to engage in an activity that best aligns with your signature strengths, the ideal is to enter into a state of flow. And the joy you derive from that state of flow is much greater, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively, than the joy gotten from instant gratifications, which don't last and which are qualitatively much more impoverished. Now, Bhagavad Gita. Many centuries before positive psychology and Seligman and flow and all these concepts came about, it had exactly the same idea, except on a deeper, it presented these ideas and justified them on a deeper spiritual basis. The key concept in the Gita is Swadharma, 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 Swadharma. It means your own law of being. Krishna in the Gita, you'll see him basically telling us to follow both those steps that Seligman talks about. First, identify your signature strengths. The Sanskrit terms used in the Gita are guna and karma. Guna and karma. Guna means our innate tendencies and qualities, and karma is our behavior, how we live and act in the world. And Krishna says, Chaturvadnyam maya srishtam guna karma vibhagayoho. I have created the 4 varnas, V-A-R-N-A, varnas, often translated as caste. The moment I say caste, people will start freaking out and say, the caste is evil. The current caste system is evil, certainly. The hereditary caste system is a huge problem in India, but really throughout the world in different respects. There are different kinds of caste systems in different countries. But that's not the caste that Gita is talking about, because what Krishna is saying is, I'm defining the 4 varnas, the 4 castes, in terms of guna and karma, each person's individual strengths and weaknesses and the way that person behaves. And ancient Indian society was designed in such a way that that society will tell the person whose strengths are in serving others and who has an ability to heal, for instance, to go into the medical field. Somebody who's very good at debating, go and become a lawyer, so on and so forth. You see, this was the original caste system. Now, how quickly it degenerated into the hereditary caste system, we don't know. But it's very important to distinguish the current caste system, which is hereditary and which has been abused for many, many years, and which has led to so many problems, with the original caste system described in the Bhagavad Gita, which is very similar, I think, to Seligman's idea of leading the good life based on identifying your signature strengths and then finding a line of work, a calling, a vocation that helps us to cultivate those strengths on a daily basis. Gita 18.47, Krishna says, Shreyan swadharmo vigunaha paradharmat swanushtitat swabhavaniyatam karma kurvan napnoti gilvisham. It's better to do the work that best suits your nature, your swabhava, even if that work has certain defects, than to do the work meant for somebody else. By doing the work in accordance with your inherent tendencies, your swabhava, you will make spiritual progress and ultimately attain the highest spiritual goal of life, which is realization of God or the self and liberation from this cycle of rebirth. What does Krishna mean by paradharma, by another person's dharma? It means don't imitate others. It's never healthy. And just because your older brother is a lawyer, that doesn't mean you have to be a lawyer. Your father expects you to be a lawyer, therefore you should be a lawyer. These are terrible reasons. Or society, in India now there's still a problem that in India, science subjects have more prestige than humanities subjects. And so invariably what happens is the best students go into science subjects, and then they go to IITs and this and that. And what does that mean? It means that the dumb students are the ones that go into humanities, unfortunately, for the most part. But this is not healthy. And of course, children are influenced by their parents and by society, and they're going to do what their parents want. But then ultimately what happens? They're unhappy because they don't do what their heart wants. They don't do what they're actually passionate about. And if the kid's unhappy, ultimately the parents are not going to be happy. So this is a big issue. So don't do what is right for you based on your own inherent tendencies. That's what the Gita teaches. And if you do that, the motivation for doing that activity will come from within. That's called, it's what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. It won't be extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic is anything, a motivation that's outside of you. It's because my parents want me to do this, because I'll disappoint my parents if I don't do this. My society prizes this more than anything else, therefore I will do it. There was a huge craze when I was graduating from undergrad, that was back in 2002, to go into management consulting. That was the big prestigious thing. So all the top graduates from Ivy Leagues would go into management consulting companies, McKinsey and all that. Now that's kind of died down a lot. But it changes every 10 years, the paradharma, what society values. It's all stupid. Do what your swadharma dictates, what you're best at. Identify your signature strengths and find something. And it requires risk. It often requires risk. I deeply disappointed my dad when I changed my college major from computer science to English literature and philosophy, God forbid. And he was livid. Now he's okay with it, but he's reconciled himself to it. I became a monk after all, and so I'm just too independent for him. All right, now I wanted to mention one more thing. This is a suggestion, and it's kind of speculative, but I think I'm onto something. So I'm happy to hear from you guys afterward about this. But I think that there's something missing in Seligman's conception of the good life. He mentions 2 steps: identify your signature strengths. Second, find a calling or a vocation that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths. I think there's a 3rd step that's missing. The 3rd step is what Gita calls doing your karma as karma yoga. Do that work, whatever your calling is, but try to do it as karma yoga. I don't find this idea in Seligman's work, even the later work, to be honest. He doesn't ask about the spirit in which you engage in that activity, whatever that work is. What's your motivation? What's the spirit of the work? That's what's all important in the Bhagavad Gita. Let me give you an example. Imagine I'm a surgeon. And there are 2 scenarios. One is I'm performing the surgery to the best of my ability, but the reason I'm doing it is because I want a promotion. And this is the way to get that promotion and to get a salary raise. And I want my name emblazoned on the newspapers because this is a very important patient that I'm about to operate on. And I want praise from my colleagues and from my boss. That's one way of doing it. And imagine that I'm also deeply attached to this work. So that suddenly if I'm fired or something, or if I'm asked to go on vacation or something, even if I'm sitting in Hollywood sipping Mai Tais, I'm still thinking about surgery because I'm too attached to the work itself. So there are a couple things. One is I'm very attached to the work, which means I can't really live without that work. And second, I'm attached to the fruits of the work. This is the way that Gita puts it, karma phala, the fruits of the work. What does that mean? It means I covet, I crave, I'm desperate for the positive things that I hope will come out of the work that I'm doing, like name and fame, like more money, like greater recognition, and so on and so forth. Scenario one, I don't see anything in what Seligman says to rule out this as a possible way of leading the good life, but clearly that's not a good life. Because what happens? Imagine if the patient dies, God forbid, but these things do happen. What happens? He's not going to get those fruits that he was expecting. Instead, he might be criticized, and so there might be a lawsuit on his hands for malpractice. He'll be plunged into misery. But now think about the same surgeon. What if I perform that surgery, the same surgery, on the same patient, but do it as karma yoga? What's the difference? The difference is huge. Gita talks about it. So Krishna says in chapter 9, Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasi yat tapasya kaunteya tat kurushva madarpanam. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever activities you engage in, do it as an offering to me. Do it as a worship of me. Change the inner attitude with which you do those things. Don't change the activities. You don't need to. Change the attitude with which you engage in those activities. And what's the attitude you should have? You should have a spiritual attitude. In theistic terms, it means offering everything you do to God. If you are not inclined to believing in God, it's much harder, but you have to just try to cultivate detachment toward the work itself and detachment toward the fruits of the work. And the beauty of bhakti, devotion, is that if you can by praying to God, God will help you to become detached toward the work and toward the fruits of the work. So God is the greatest helper in performing karma yoga, in doing work as karma yoga. Now imagine the same surgeon, but as a karma yogi, the person who does the surgery as karma yoga. Imagine that this patient tragically dies. That person, the doctor obviously has done the surgery to the best of his or her ability. There's a saying in India, do your best, leave the rest. You do your best on your part, you leave the rest to God. Because success and failure is not in our hands. This is really important. Sri Ramakrishna would say, God laughs twice. One time when there are two brothers bickering over property. One brother saying, this land is mine. The other one saying, no, it's mine. And many families, especially in India, know, because they're extended families, and so there are a lot of property disputes. And God laughs. Why does God laugh? Because nothing is anyone's. Everything is God's. All that property is God's and nobody else's. Second time God laughs is when a doctor tells a patient with great confidence, even arrogance, I will save you. A doctor should never say that. God laughs. Because it's only God who can save. Doctors can't save. And so the karma yogi surgeon knows this. He knows that even if he does the surgery to the best of his ability, whether the patient lives or dies is not up to him, it's up to God. And so even if the patient dies, of course, he's not going to be thrilled about it, but it will not throw his entire life out of whack and make him depressed for a long time. And this person, as a karma yogi, he's doing the surgery as a worship of God, as a service to humanity, and not for the sake of name and fame and for that salary raise. He may get those things incidentally, but that's not the aim. You see, and just compare the mental state of the surgeon who's doing the surgery as karma yoga with the surgeon who's doing it just as karma, not as karma yoga, but with a worldly attitude, with worldly aims and desires in mind. obviously the karma yogi is going to be leading a more fulfilling and happier life in the end, right? I think that's the element that's missing from Seligman's model of the good life. So it's that third step. Try to do, so number one, identify your signature strengths. Number two, find a calling or vocation that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths. But what's not found in Seligman, or even I think in later positive psychology yet, but I haven't studied extensively, so I don't want to say that too confidently. One of you might know positive psychology better than I do. So maybe there's an equivalent of karma yoga among some contemporary psychologists, then I'd love to know about that. But I think what's missing in positive psychology is doing this work, which is in accordance with your signature strengths, as karma yoga. Okay, which means you do it as a service to humanity and as a worship of God, and you try to be detached toward the work itself, and also try to be detached toward the fruits of the work. Your main aim is not getting certain name and fame or other kinds of success from doing the work. And finally, the third and final kind of life that Seligman talks about, and this is the ideal paradigm, he thinks. The meaningful life. He says even the good life is not quite enough. It's an essential component to leading an ultimately fulfilling life, but it's not enough on its own. We have to combine the good life with what he calls a meaningful life. We have to imbue what we do in our day-to-day lives with meaning, with the higher purpose. And Seligman, typically for Western scientists, is a kind of, I mean, I don't know if he comes right out and says it, but either atheist or agnostic, or maybe an agnostic leaning toward atheism, maybe we can say. And he has these pretty weak arguments for why he doesn't believe in God, like the problem of evil, as if there haven't been thousands of years of discussion of this problem in theology and philosophy of religion. So he thinks that God has been debunked. The idea that God created this world is nonsense. So I'm not going to go into that because I mean, it's so sort of childish as philosophy that it's not worth engaging. No offense to Seligman, if anyone is friends with him. But no, I want to focus on something else. He asks, what does higher purpose mean? What counts as a higher purpose that gives what we're doing a greater meaning? And he gives a whole list. He includes people who are religious or spiritual. So the aim of enlightenment, nirvana, realizing God, those kinds of things. But he says, but that's not necessary. He says that there are other ways. You can be an activist, an environmental activist, a social activist, this and that. That could be your higher purpose. Those are higher purposes. But I think from a Vedantic standpoint, I think the line would be, and I agree with it, you can argue with me about it. If you spend your whole life doing environmental activism, but without a higher transcendental purpose, you're still not going to live an ultimately fulfilling life. That's my feeling. It's not a coincidence that I've become a Vedantin monk. So, but I encourage you to disagree with that and to, argue with me about it. But why? Because it's all impermanent ultimately. Even if Greta Thunberg, she's one of these great young environmental activists, even if she somehow succeeds in convincing the oil industries to stop making, oil fuel vehicles and whatever, and this and that, and the environment gets much better, she's still going to die by the time she's 100 roughly. That's being generous. And then what does she take with her? So Vedanta says that higher purpose needs to be a permanent one. It needs to be eternal. So it needs to be spiritual or transcendental. And then Bhagavad Gita, and this is how I'll conclude the lecture on this note, because I've talked so much about instant gratification and Bhagavad Gita's explanation of rajasika forms of happiness that I haven't gotten yet to sattvika forms of happiness. So in 18.37, Gita talks about sattvika happiness. Krishna says, Yattad agre vishamiva pariname mritopamam tatsukham sattvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. Sattvika happiness is a joy that is born of the satisfaction of the higher mind, the buddhi, and the soul, the atman. The word is atma buddhi prasadajam. It's a beautiful phrase in Sanskrit. Sattvika happiness is like poison in the beginning, but eventually it becomes like nectar. So notice how the Gita here is contrasting qualitatively Rajasica happiness from Sattvika happiness. Why qualitative? Because it gratifies a different level of being in us. Rajasica forms of happiness, all forms of instant gratification, gratify either the body or the mind, or both at once. And Sattvika forms of joy gratify the soul, the deeper eternal soul within us, which is a spark of immortal bliss. That's the link between, so the idea here in the Gita is, and here I think this is also not really found in positive psychology. What Gita says is, try to the best of your ability to replace Rajasica forms of happiness, so all forms of instant gratification, with forms of Sattvika happiness, which are forms of many different kinds of delayed gratification, which gratify the deeper soul rather than the body-mind complex. Ultimately, by doing that, what happens? We're able to break our identification with the body-mind complex. That is the root of all our suffering. And we're going to be able to realize our deeper spiritual nature as souls, eternal souls. That's the reason why, that's the deeper philosophical and kind of metaphysical reason why delayed gratification and why Sattvika forms of happiness give us much greater fulfillment in the end than Rajasica forms of happiness, like instant gratification. This is not something you find in positive psychology. And of course, positive psychologists like Seligman might say like, well, but this is all dogma and how do you prove it and this and that. So that we can talk about that in the question and answer session. But, and I've talked about this in the last lecture on the 3 gunas, so I'm not going to go into detail about what are some of these Sattvika forms of happiness, but I contrasted, for instance, last time, listening to pop music, for instance, with listening to demanding forms of classical music. Spiritual classical music. Some of my favorites are Arvo Pärt and Bach and others. What kind of movies do you watch? You know, just the Hollywood blockbusters, or do you also watch deeper, more soulful films that make you think, that make you actually, not just think, I mean, it goes more deeply, where it touches the heart. They might be slow, and people who are very Rajasic can't stand them. They'll fall asleep. They'll start snoring. So it's something you have to cultivate. It's like poison in the beginning, as I said. For most people, so making somebody who's gorged, who's spent their whole life watching Hollywood movies, make them watch like The Flowers of St. Francis or something. It's a beautiful film by Rossellini about the life of St. Francis. Probably fall asleep or just find it boring. That's one of the standard criticisms that Rajasic people make about Sattvika things. Classical music, boring. It's not like Taylor Swift or Drake or whatever. But if you can cultivate it, and of course not everybody can, unfortunately, not at least in this life, they might in the future life. It depends on their inherent tendencies, their samskaras. But if you work at it, many people will be able to cultivate a taste for it. That's true of all these Sattvika forms of happiness. Physical exercise is a good example. In the beginning, it's like poison for many people, not all. Some people are born athletes, they love doing it. But for a lot of people, getting up out of bed is the hard part. No, I prefer to sit on the couch and watch a football game or whatever it is. But once you develop a habit, a regular habit of physical exercise, what happens? You look forward to it. You get up out of bed, you drink some water, and you go off on your run. It becomes like nectar in the end. So it's the opposite structure of Rajasica happiness. Rajasica happiness begins like nectar, ultimately becomes like poison. Sattvika happiness feels like poison in the beginning, ultimately becomes like nectar. Spiritual practice, all forms of spiritual practice, mindfulness meditation, japa, prayer, karma yoga, you name it, falls into this category of Sattvika joy. Is it easy? Absolutely not. But if you persist at it and you stick with it, you will be far happier in the end. You'll be more fulfilled than you would have been otherwise. All right, so let me mention one more very brief thing and then I'll wrap it up. I told you that the way I framed this entire talk was in terms of Seligman's 2002 book called Authentic Happiness. He's a prolific psychologist and he's written a lot more. And he wrote a book in 2012 called Flourish, where he kind of reflects on this earlier book and he finds some limitations in it, partly as a result of conversations with other people, smart people. And he presents a kind of a revised paradigm, which he calls PERMA plus, P-E-R-M-A plus. And I'll very briefly go through what this acronym stands for. P stands for positive emotion. So this kind of captures the instant gratification. He says he doesn't say you should just get rid of all instant gratifications. That's not realistic. Have it, but that can't be your main aim. And engage in that in moderation. That's the P, positive emotion, happiness. And have a positive attitude, be cheerful. Engagement, that's the E, the second letter in PERMA. What he means by this is what's captured by this good life, which is identify your signature strengths, find a vocation that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths. Third is R, relationships. This he didn't emphasize so much in the earlier book. And this is really important. And this is also linked to the Bhagavad Gita, because you should try to make all of your relationships with other people, with your pets, with whoever it is, your colleagues, your loved ones, as sattvic as possible, because there are different ways of relating to other human beings. And a very rajasic way of doing it, we talked about this last time, I think, would be what psychologists call an unhealthy codependence. Where you're both extremely attached to each other, and so you can't stay 1 minute apart from each other. This is not at all healthy. So try to make your relationship with your partner, with your children, more sattvic. Try to be detached. You can be loving and detached. This is a difficult thing. It seems paradoxical or even contradictory, but that's what we need to aim for as spiritual aspirants. Love these people, but in a spirit of detachment. Sri Ramakrishna would distinguish Maya and Daya in Bengali, in Sanskrit. He'd say Maya is selfish attachment. You love your wife because she's your wife. You love your kids because they're your kids. You love your Lexus because it's your Lexus. Do you love another person's kid as much as you love your own? Probably not. That's Maya. Daya, by contrast, is, he says, having equal love for everybody because you see the same God dwelling in everyone. That's what we need to strive for as spiritual aspirants. All right, thank you.
So at this point, if anybody has any questions, just raise your hands and we can address any questions. Your microphone.
Sure. What's your name?
1 second. Okay.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
I guess perspective, or I find myself struggling to find, I guess, like calling.
Yeah.
I'll try different stuff.
Yeah.
I guess I get a little confused.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Yeah, but remember what I said is, I mean, that's perfectly reasonable and that often happens. But as I said, do you have a best friend or a sibling or an enlightened parent? I say enlightened parent because most parents aren't enlightened. They might tell you to do things for the wrong reasons. Or somebody in your life, or a career counselor, or someone who can kind of help guide you, maybe a therapist, somebody who kind of can kind of see you as you are and is not afraid to tell you, to be honest with you. I think you need somebody like that to help guide you. And as I said, that survey that is online, that character strength survey, that's helpful. And so I can give you the link after this. Yeah, sure.
We also have an online question.
Mm-hmm.
So this person asks, if happiness is the absence of desire, then what would you say is the relationship between happiness and ananda?
Happiness, and what's the last word you said?
Ananda.
Ananda. Yeah, okay, so Ananda is a Sanskrit term it's translated really not as happiness, but as bliss most of the time. And it's actually one of the three main epithets of ultimate reality, Brahman, Sat Chit Ananda. Sat Chit Ananda. So ultimate reality, Brahman, is Sat. It's the only eternal existence. It's also Chit. It's the only conscious. It's consciousness. It's pure consciousness. And Ananda, but it's also blissful and in more deeply bliss itself. So I'm part of the problem is this. I'm not entirely clear on what the question is, because is what kind of happiness is the person talking about?
Maybe he's referring to something like, can happiness be a gateway to Ananda?
Oh,
so just think of it like that.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So if the question is, can happiness be a gateway to Ananda? I think the answer is yes, and I think Gita says emphatically yes. But what kind of happiness is the gateway to Ananda? Sattvika happiness. We need to cultivate sattvika forms of joy. of Sukham, explained in that verse that I read out to you, which are like poison in the beginning and like nectar in the end, which gratify the deeper soul within us rather than the body-mind complex. Those forms of happiness are the gateway to Ananda. And actually, indirectly, you can say Rajasika forms of happiness too, instant gratification. You know how? Schopenhauer puts it very poignantly, but kind of also devastatingly. He says, he was influenced by Vedanta, and he was very inspired by the life of great saints in different traditions, Christian saints, Vedantic saints. And then he asks this question in his philosophical treatise. He says, but where does that leave the rest of us who are very ordinary people? We don't have the strength, the ability, the courage to engage in these kinds of spiritual practices, these austerities, self-abnegation. He says, for the rest of us, there is the way of suffering. For the rest of us, there's the path of suffering. Swami Medhananda said the same thing. He said, suffering is the great eye-opener. And so, Rajasika happiness too, in a way, can help us to Ananda. How? Because it's, as I said, well, as Sri Ramakrishna said, we don't feel that true spirit of detachment until we have passed through the end of enjoyments. Some of us have to be like King Yayati, and we have to go through a lot of instant gratification, a lot of this Rajasika happiness, various kinds of addictions, and struggle through them. And then when we come out of them, we come out wiser and deeper and more profound. And it's then that we look back and say, this is not the way to Ananda, the term that the questioner is using. Let me try a better way to Ananda. You see, so it's a school of hard knocks. If we don't learn the easy way, we learn the hard way. Yeah. What's your name? Padma.
You mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita for Swadharma, he talks about the guna and the karma being, implementing your Swadharma.
Right.
Because I found that the Seligman's view, by taking the signature strength, that seems more about your guna. Is there an angle of a karma point of view in Seligman's view of how we find our calling? Is there an angle?
Yeah, I think he would say that the two are related, and I think the Gita would agree with that in a way. I mean, how do you even know what your inherent strengths are until you actually put them into practice? You know what I mean? We might think we're good at something, or we might like to think that we're good at something. If my father is like a famous cellist or something, like a world-class cellist, and he's been trying to groom me from a young age, I might very deeply want to be a great cellist. I might think I have the inherent strength of a cellist, but then when I actually come to play, my dad's like, all right, that's enough. So I think that, put your strengths, what you think are strengths, to the test by actually trying to do something and see whether you have a strength. If you're a parent, you'll know you can tell right away with your kids whether they have a strength in drawing or in math right? I mean, that's very obvious, but it's because of what they do that you can tell, right? So I think that, work is definitely in Seligman as far as I can tell. What I think is missing is the attitude with which you do the work, your inner motivation. The spirit of the work,
And that context, given that we're in a very success-oriented culture, where all our role models are, or these role models are shown, all these successful people. So how do we cultivate the detachment from the outcome?
I think it requires inner strength and courage. And this is not even necessarily a spiritual thing, but this is a life lesson for most people. It's just, don't do things for the wrong reasons. And there are plenty of wrong reasons. To please your parents, because that's what, as you said, society prizes as the most successful life. But do it because you think that's the right thing for you to do, and that's the best thing for you to do. And that's the best way for you to contribute to society. That's the best way for you to come into your own, to fulfill yourself, and to attain a higher spiritual purpose in life. How do you do it? That's, as I said, it requires tremendous strength and courage. But fortunately, we have infinite strength within us, because each one of us is a spark of immortal bliss. And if we can just tap into that soul power in us, then we won't be lacking in strength and courage. I think that we end up in this culture, actually, kind of another problem with contemporary culture is that it's too much of a coddling culture. I think somebody wrote a book, Jonathan Haidt or somebody, called The Coddling of the American Mind. Safe spaces, and I don't want to offend anybody. And nowadays, that's another problem, is getting canceled. So anyway, but God, that stuff makes me nauseous. So less of the safe space and more of the kind of, risk entering dangerous spaces. And yeah.
There's another online question. What is the relationship between altered state of consciousness and higher states?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to talk about this in detail, not in detail, but to some extent tomorrow in Trabuco, because my lecture tomorrow is called Self-Deception in Spiritual Life. And spoiler alert, one of the 5 main ways that we deceive ourselves is by thinking that we can attain higher states of consciousness through drugs. Drugs can certainly alter our state of consciousness. I think in some cases it can give us spiritual experiences, but at a great cost. And the cost is too high. And it's a longer discussion, but I think that that's what the questioner has in mind. Swami Prabhupada, who was the first head of our Hollywood Center, Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood, when he was in India, when he was a young monastic, on Shivaratri, the day of the Shiva Puja, Siddhi is offered to Shiva, which is a kind of hallucinogenic, or at least a certain kind of psychedelic drug made from THC. And he took 1 cup of that. And then another monk, without realizing he had already had a cup, gave him another cup of prasad. And it's prasada, which means it's sanctified because it's just been offered to Shiva. And so how do you say no to that? And so he downs a second cup of Siddhi. And his first, just within a few minutes, he starts feeling really, really uneasy and he thinks he's going to die. And because he thinks he's going to die, he starts saying, Jai Shri Ram Krishna, Jai Shri Ram Krishna, because he's literally preparing to die. Then after a couple hours, he realizes he's not going to die. It might be familiar to some of you. And the drug high lasts for 3 days. And he says that he started seeing people as lighted, Lighthed. Like, I guess what that means is like certain kind of auras around people, not around everybody, but around certain people. And then interestingly, one of the monks got worried about him. And so they called the doctor in. The doctor's a friend of Prabhupada. The doctor comes in, but Prabhupada doesn't want to talk to him because he doesn't see him as lighted. He sees him as dark. There's a kind of dark aura around him and he doesn't want to talk to him. It's weird and kind of like sort of more occult than mystical or spiritual, I would say. And then after that 3-day period, he says there was a 6-month period of spiritual dryness where he lost all faith in God and spiritual life. It was devastating to him. And on that basis, he warned his own disciples and devotees when he came to the West, because imagine 60s and hippies and Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, who wrote the famous book, The Doors of Perception, based on his mescaline experiences, was a disciple of Prabhupada. And Prabhupada was very critical of Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd, who is the founder of Trabuco Candy, actually. So we have interesting connections with drugs. But Prabhupada was uncompromising. And he said, drugs can give you what he called psychic experiences, but it cannot give you spiritual experiences. Now, what exactly he meant by psychic experiences, I think maybe there is a clear definition somewhere in his work, which I haven't found, but I wish you were a little bit clearer about that. But I think that incident of his own drug experience actually helps explain what it is. He's seeing auras. He's not enjoying Ananda, certainly. It's not a blissful experience. And it's more kind of psychic in the sense of like actual psychics who can like look into your mind, tell the future, see auras, maybe do automatic writing, this kind of stuff. But spiritual, no. That seems to be, that's the position in our order. And part of the reason in our tradition why we strongly discourage drug use is because you're surrendering your agency to an external, a physical substance. And that's never safe in spiritual life. You don't want to surrender your agency. You don't want to surrender control to a drug. Spiritual life is all about strength, as I said, and courage, and about tapping into your deeper, infinite, divine nature. And if in the first step you're giving your agency away to a substance, you've kind of short-circuited your spiritual life from the beginning. Now, on a positive side, or the silver, some people, I've generally seen this, that some people, their gateway to spiritual life is through some kind of drug experience. That's possible. It might be that getting high or something is the way that they're first open to the possibility of states of consciousness beyond the ordinary mind. If that's the case, then good. If you can stop using drugs after that, and then you just focus on your spiritual practices and you're not impatient to kind of replicate that experience. We have to be careful about trying to take shortcuts in spiritual life. Spiritual life isn't easy. And Hindus believe, as I said, in karma and rebirth. And spiritual life is not a journey of one lifetime, but of many lifetimes. And we'll make a certain amount of progress in this life. And we'll continue to make progress in subsequent lives. So let's not be impatient.